My name is Margaret David. I'm 69 years old, a widow, and I live in a quiet neighborhood in Oregon, the kind of place where nothing changes except the weather. I've worked at Caldwell and Walker Law Firm for 18 years. My job title says office manager, but I've been everything: counselor, mother, bookkeeper, and therapist for every lawyer who's ever forgotten how to be human. My husband, Michael, died when I was 41. Heart attack. Sudden. I remember the way his coffee cup was still half full when the paramedics came. After that, my life narrowed to 2 names: Emily and Luke. My children. My reason to keep breathing. I made them a promise that day. They would never have to struggle the way I did. I kept that promise. Every bill, every tear, every lost night of sleep, I carried it for them. Until last Tuesday. That was the day the email arrived. Soft hum of a computer booting up. Keys tapping. I remember it clearly. 6:47 a.m. Black coffee in hand, the smell of rain on the porch. My inbox blinked with one new message. From Emily David. I smiled. I thought maybe she was sharing her wedding playlist or a picture of her dress. We'd been planning her wedding in Napa Valley for months. I had already given her $30,000, a lifetime of savings, for the venue, the photographer, and the florist she'd dreamed about since college. But when I opened that email, everything stopped. Mom! After a lot of discussion, Andrew and I decided that it's best for you to attend the wedding virtually. Andrew's mother wants a very intimate event, limited guests. We've set up a Google Meet link so you can still be part of it. It'll be just like being there. LOL. Pause. Silence. Clock ticking. Just like being there. I stared at the screen. My coffee went cold. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. Something inside me shifted. A quiet, dangerous stillness. I wrote back only 4 words. Sure. Enjoy your big day. And I meant it. Not in bitterness, not yet, but in clarity. Because I realized in that moment that my sacrifices were invisible. I had become a transaction. That was the day the old version of me died, and something else began to wake up. The silence. The next morning, I drove to work as if nothing had changed. The world still turned, people still smiled. But inside me, there was only silence. Robert, my boss, noticed it right away. He's one of those rare men who remember birthdays and how you take your coffee. He said, "You look like you've seen a ghost," setting a latte on my desk. I wanted to tell him everything. How my daughter had just uninvited me from her wedding. How she had replaced me with a live stream. But instead, I just smiled and said, "Didn't sleep well." He didn't push. And that small kindness, that silence, nearly broke me. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Emily again. "Mom, please call me. It's not what you think. This isn't funny. Andrew's mom is just particular. Please understand." I didn't reply. Not yet. Because for once in my life, I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't chase love that kept walking away. That afternoon, as the rain drummed against the office window, I opened a blank document on my computer.
I didn't know what I was doing. Not yet. But my fingers started typing anyway, almost on their own. To whom concern regarding the pending acquisition of Walker Holdings by Dalton and Reeves. Legal correspondence, corporate documents, numbers, details. I wasn't writing about Emily. I was reminding myself of something. I wasn't just a mother. I was the woman who managed confidential files, who knew every secret that passed through those firm walls, including those of Andrew's family. Because Dalton and Reeves, the firm negotiating the merger with our clients, was Andrew's family firm. And suddenly, I wasn't just an outsider. I was inside the walls of their empire. The seed of revenge. It started small, quiet. A thought, not a plan. I didn't want to hurt Emily. I just wanted her to see me. But the more I learned about Andrew's family, the more I realized something wasn't right. Dalton and Reeves wasn't as spotless as their wine-stained Napa smiles suggested. There were shell companies, misreported earnings, and one particularly suspicious set of invoices from overseas. It was buried deep, disguised as consulting fees. I filed the document away, my hand steady, my heart colder than it had ever been. That night, I went home, poured myself a glass of wine, and watched the email again. Just like being there. I whispered to myself, "No, Emily, you'll see what it's like to be left out." Soft ticking transitions to darker music, a heartbeat rhythm. Over the next weeks, I stayed quiet, calm, professional. No one at work suspected anything, but every spare minute, I was piecing together something, a web of truths, each one leading back to the Daltons. I didn't plan to destroy them, not at first. I just wanted justice, clarity, something clean. But revenge never stays clean. It grows teeth. I still remember Emily at 5 years old, chocolate on her cheeks, her hair in braids. She used to tell me, "Mommy, when I get married, you'll be my maid of honor." And I promised I would be. When she was 17, I caught her smoking behind the garage. She cried, said she didn't want to disappoint me. When she was 20, I helped her move into her first apartment. When she was 27, I flew to New York when her heart was broken and made her tea in that tiny, cold kitchen. Every memory was a thread, every sacrifice a stitch. And that email had cut through all of it like scissors. Silence. Then slow fade to present. The gift. 2 weeks before the wedding, I received another email, a formal one this time. Subject: Napa Valley Wedding SRVP reminder. Dear Margaret, please confirm your attendance via virtual link. They wanted me to RSVP to my own wedding as if I were a stranger. So I did. But not with a click, with an idea. I started sending a few anonymous documents to the Oregon Department of Financial Regulation. Just enough to raise questions about Dalton and Reeves. Nothing criminal. Just smoke. Enough to make someone look closer. Because once the smoke starts, the fire finds its way. The wedding approaches. 3 weeks later, my office was buzzing. The Dalton and Reeves merger was on hold, pending review. Robert called me in. "Margaret, did you hear? Someone tipped off the regulators. This could take months. I nodded. Strange, isn't it? He sighed. Their lead counsel's a wreck, Andrew Dalton. You know him? I looked him dead in the eye. My daughter's fiancé. Beat. Silence. Robert froze. Oh, God. I'm sorry. I didn't. It's fine. People get what they deserve. And I smiled. Just a little.
Margaret woke up before dawn the morning of the rehearsal. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft patter of rain against the kitchen window. She sat at the table with her laptop open, its glow carving faint lines across her tired face. On the screen, folders were arranged like puzzle pieces: financial records, private correspondence, contracts, names. She wasn't sure when it had stopped being about dignity and started being about power. In the weeks since she'd sent the first anonymous documents, things had accelerated. The investigation had moved from whispers to official letters. Dalton and Reeves was bleeding money, losing clients. Andrew's name appeared in every headline. Emily called again and again. "Mom, please answer me. I don't know what's happening, but Andrew is losing his mind. He says someone's sabotaging him." Margaret would listen to the messages, but never reply. She couldn't. Each voicemail was a thread pulling at what little was left of her restraint. At work, Robert kept his distance. He had begun to suspect, she could tell. There was a weight to the way he looked at her, something between admiration and fear. He didn't ask questions, and she never offered answers. Late one evening, she stood by her office window and watched the city lights smear across the rain. Below, lawyers hurried to cars, clutching their briefcases as if they could protect them from the storm. She thought of all the years she'd spent keeping their secrets safe, hiding other people's sins. She'd become an expert in silence, and silence, she had learned, was a weapon. The day before the wedding, a brown envelope arrived at her door. Inside was an embossed invitation, hand-delivered, no note. For the first time in weeks, she laughed. Someone, perhaps Emily, still wanted her there. Or maybe they just wanted her silence. She booked a ticket that night. The flight to Napa felt like floating through fog. She didn't tell anyone she was coming. When she landed, she rented a modest sedan, drove through the rolling vineyards until the air smelled of rain and earth. The Dalton estate rolls ahead of her, a marble monument to old money and new arrogance. She parked a mile away and walked the rest of the distance along the vineyard road. The air was heavy with roses and thunder. From a hill above the ceremony site, she could see the tented reception, the rows of white chairs, the orchestra rehearsing beneath chandeliers of crystal and light. She watched her daughter glide across the lawn, radiant, unaware. Emily's laughter floated up the hill, bright and sharp. Beside her stood Andrew, his smile strained. Andrew's phone was in his hand, his jaw tight as he read a message. That message, she knew, would be from the regulators. The official shutdown order had been filed that morning, the company's accounts frozen. His family's empire, everything they built on fraud, was about to collapse in public view. Margaret waited until the ceremony began. She stood by the trees, close enough to hear the vows. The priest spoke of love, of truth, of unity. Margaret's hands trembled around the small envelope she held. Inside were the final documents, proof of Andrew's crimes, of Emily's knowledge, of every lie they had woven together. She hadn't wanted to believe Emily was part of it, but the evidence was there. The transfers,
the hidden accounts in her name. The way she'd signed off on papers she didn't understand or didn't want to. The priest asked if anyone objected. The silence was perfect. Then Margaret stepped forward. The guests turned confused. Emily froze mid-smile. Andrew's mother rose from her chair, whispering something to the security guard, but no one moved fast enough. Margaret's voice was steady. She said, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something your guests should see." She opened the envelope and let the pages fall like snow across the aisle. Copies of wire transfers, company seals, signatures. Proof of theft, of deceit, of rot. Cameras flashed. Someone gasped. The wind picked up, scattering papers across white linens and polished shoes. Emily's voice cracked. "Mom, what are you doing?" "I'm showing you what being invisible looks like," Margaret said. Andrew lunged forward, grabbing at the documents, but it was too late. Guests were already filming. The truth had its own momentum now. Police cars arrived an hour later. The wedding never finished. Reporters camped outside the gates as the Dalton family was questioned, their accounts frozen, their empire collapsing live on every screen. Margaret didn't stay to watch. She walked back down the hill, her shoes muddy, her dress wet with rain. Each step felt lighter, emptier. At the hotel that night, she sat on the balcony and watched lightning split the sky. Her phone buzzed with messages. Robert, Emily, unknown numbers. She turned it face down. The next morning, there was a knock at her door. Emily stood there, eyes red, hair tangled. She looked smaller than Margaret remembered. "Why?" she whispered. Margaret poured coffee into 2 cups and handed her one. "You sent me a link. You wanted me to watch." "I did," Margaret said. Emily's lips trembled. "You destroyed everything." "I didn't destroy it. I just stopped protecting it." They sat in silence, the rain easing into mist. Finally, Emily reached across the table, her hand shaking. "What happens now?" Margaret looked out at the gray horizon. "Now, you live with what you built." She stood, picked up her suitcase, and walked past her daughter. At the airport, she watched planes take off one after another, silver against the clouds. She felt neither triumph nor regret, but only a quiet emptiness. Revenge hadn't filled the hollow, it had just cleared it of illusion. When the announcement for boarding came, she didn't move. Instead, she opened her phone and typed a message to Robert. "I'm taking some time off. Tell them not to look for me." She powered it down, left the phone on the seat beside her, and walked toward the exit instead of the gate. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of rain and roses. Somewhere behind her, Emily was still calling her name. Margaret kept walking until the voices were gone, until the world was quiet again. And in that silence, the only thing left was the echo of her own heartbeat. Slow, steady, and finally free.
Weeks passed like a blur of rain in quiet mornings. Margaret rented a small cabin near the coast, a place where no one knew her name, and the ocean drowned out every thought. The air smelled of pine and salt. She spent her days walking along the cliffs, watching waves break against the rocks like glass. For the first time in years, there were no phone calls, no responsibilities, no one to care for but herself. She thought she'd feel peace, but peace never came. It was replaced by a strange hollowness, a space too wide and too quiet. At night, she'd wake to the sound of the wind through the trees and think it was someone whispering her name. Sometimes she'd dream of Emily at 5 years old, running barefoot through the yard, laughing. she'd wake up with that sound still in her chest, sharp as grief. The world had moved on without her. News outlets talked for weeks about the Dalton scandal. Fraud, embezzlement, betrayal. Andrew had been charged. His family's assets frozen. Emily's name appeared in the stories too. A footnote at first, then a headline. Bride implicated in family fraud case. Margaret read each article once, then folded it neatly and burned it in the fireplace. One afternoon, a letter arrived forwarded from her old office. It was from Robert. Margaret, I don't know where you are, but I wanted you to know I left Caldwell and Walker. After what happened, I realized how much we all take from people like you, the ones who keep the world running quietly. I hope you find something softer than justice. You deserve that. She stared at the letter for a long time. The words, softer than justice, stayed with her. The next morning, she drove into town and sat by a small cafe window, watching the rain blur faces as people passed. Across the street, a woman helped her elderly mother step over a puddle, holding her arm with quiet patience. Margaret felt something twist inside her, something that wasn't anger this time, but longing. She took out a piece of paper and began to write. It wasn't a letter of apology or forgiveness. It was a record, a story. She wrote about Michael, about the night she worked double shifts, about the sound of Emily's laughter, and the weight of silence. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the light outside turned gold. That evening, she sealed the pages in an envelope and addressed it simply, to Emily. She didn't send it, not yet, maybe not ever. She placed it on the mantel of the cabin and left it there, like an unfinished prayer. The days grew shorter, the ocean grew colder. One night, she walked farther along the cliffs than usual. The wind was fierce, whipping her hair against her face. Below her, the tide roared like something alive. She thought of all the years she'd lived for other people, the sacrifices that had turned her invisible. She thought of the moment she'd finally been seen, but only through destruction. In the distance, a single light blinked from a ship moving toward the horizon. For a moment, she imagined Michael there, waiting, smiling like he used to. She closed her eyes and whispered into the wind, "I did it, Mike. I kept my promise. They never struggled." The sea answered with its endless rhythm. She turned back toward the cabin, her coat heavy with rain. When she reached the door, she found a small box on the steps. No name, no return address. Inside was a flash drive and a folded note. "Mom, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. I saw everything you did and I understand now. You were right. Some lessons need to hurt. I'm leaving the country for a while. Andrew's gone. The trial destroyed him. But I'll rebuild. If you ever want to see me again, the files on this drive will clear your name. You didn't hide your trail as well as you think. They're investigating. Please protect yourself and Emily." Margaret sat down on the porch, the rain soaking through her clothes. She plugged the drive into her laptop and watched as folders opened. Copies of her emails, the whistleblower reports, evidence that pointed directly to her. Emily had gathered everything. For a long time, Margaret said nothing. Then slowly, she smiled. Of course her daughter had learned. She'd always been smart. The next morning, Margaret packed a single bag. She burned the envelope she'd written, watched the words curl into ash. She left the cabin keys on the table and walked toward the rising sun, her shoes crunching against the gravel path. By the time the investigators reached the cabin, she was already gone. The neighbors said they saw a woman matching her description board a bus heading north, but no one was sure. Weeks later, a postcard arrived at Robert's desk.
A single line written in careful script. Tell them not to look for me. The ocean keeps secrets better than people do. He read it twice before slipping it into a drawer. Outside, the rain began again, steady and soft. Somewhere far from Oregon, on a quiet stretch of coastline, where cliffs meet gray sea, a woman walked alone, her footprints fading behind her as the tide rose. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She had become what she always was, quiet, unseen, and stronger than anyone had imagined. And as the waves erased the last trace of her path, the world finally forgot her name. But the silence she left behind would echo for years. Spring returned slowly, soft and pale, washing the coastline in mist. The storms had eased, but Margaret stayed where she was, tucked inside a small cottage that smelled of cedar and salt. She'd taken a job at the library in a nearby town under a different name, cataloging old legal texts that no one read anymore. People there called her Mrs. Reed. She smiled politely, kept her head down, and never mentioned the life she'd left behind. Every morning, she walked to work before sunrise. The streets were quiet, the ocean a gray shimmer in the distance. She liked the silence. It was clean, uncomplicated. Sometimes she almost convinced herself she had found peace. But ghosts travel light. They don't need names or faces to follow you. One afternoon, as she was shelving a stack of books, she noticed a man at the reading table, watching her. Mid-40s, crisp suit, polite smile. He looked like someone who didn't belong in a seaside library. When she passed by, he said softly, "Beautiful place. Peaceful." She nodded, but didn't slow down. He waited a moment, then added, "You used to work for Caldwell and Walker, didn't you, Mrs. Collins?" Her body went cold. The book slipped from her hand and hit the floor. He didn't move closer, just watched her with steady eyes. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here to warn you. There's still a case open. They haven't stopped looking." Margaret's throat tightened. "Who sent you?" "Someone who thinks you deserve to know what's coming." He slid a small card across the table. No name, just a number written in black ink. "When you're ready." He stood, buttoned his coat, and walked out into the fading light. That night, she sat by the window, staring at the card. She thought about Emily's letter, about the flash drive she'd left behind. Maybe this man was connected. Maybe her daughter had sent him. Or maybe he was one of the ones who never stopped hunting. Either way, she was tired of running. She dialed the number. A familiar voice answered. "Mom?" For a second, she couldn't speak. "Emily?" "I didn't know if you'd call," her daughter said, her voice small, trembling. "I'm in Canada. I thought you should know. They're building a case against both of us. They traced the documents back to your firm. To me. I've been questioned twice already." "You should have destroyed the files," Margaret said quietly. "I couldn't," Emily whispered. "They were the only proof that you were the whistleblower. I wanted to protect you." Margaret looked out the window at the dark waves curling against the shore. "You shouldn't have followed me into this. I'm your daughter. I already was in it." For a long moment, neither spoke. Rain began to fall again, soft and persistent. Finally, Margaret said, "Where are you?" Emily gave her a small coastal town, hours away. "I can't stay long. They're watching everything." Margaret hesitated, then said, "Meet me halfway." They met the next day at a gas station cafe off the highway. Emily looked older, thinner, but her eyes, her father's eyes, were still the same. They sat across from each other in a booth, two ghosts sharing coffee. "I read the articles. They think you disappeared at sea." "I let them," Margaret replied. "People don't look for the dead." Emily's hands shook around her cup. "What are we going to do?" Margaret looked at her daughter for a long moment. "You're going to live," she said. "You're going to disappear, and this time you'll do it right. Leave the files, leave the guilt, leave me." "I can't," Emily said, tears forming. "You're all I have left." Margaret reached across the table, took her daughter's hand, and held it tight. "Then you'll do it for me." They sat in silence until the coffee went cold. Outside, the clouds broke, letting in a sliver of light. When Emily went to the restroom, Margaret slipped a folded note into her purse. Then she stood, paid the bill, and walked out to her car. The note would be found hours later. It read, "Emily, this story ends with me. You start a new one. Don't come looking. They'll follow the trail to me, not to you. That's how it was always meant to be. Mom." By the time Emily came running into the parking lot, Margaret's car was already gone, swallowed by the rain and the curve of the road. 2 days later, authorities discovered a vehicle abandoned near the cliffs. The license plate was registered to Margaret Collins. Inside, they found a coat, a pair of shoes, and the sound of waves crashing far below. No body was ever recovered. Some said she jumped. Others said she fled again, this time for good. But months later, on a remote island off the Alaskan coast, a fisherman swore he met a woman named Mrs. Reed, who lived alone near the lighthouse. She spent her evenings writing letters she never mailed and watching the horizon until dark. When asked about her family, she'd smile faintly and say, "I had a daughter once. She finally learned how to save herself." And when the wind rose, carrying the sea spray through the cliffs, the locals claimed they could hear a woman's voice, soft, steady, and unbroken, whispering through the fog. Silence remembers what justice forgets.
Winter had returned to the Oregon coast, slow, gray, and merciless. The sea was a steel mirror, waves slamming against the cliffs as if trying to reclaim something they'd once owned. 3 years had passed since Margaret's supposed death. The newspapers had long stopped mentioning her name. The investigation faded quietly, buried beneath fresher scandals. Caldwell and Walker Law had collapsed after leaked documents exposed years of corruption and fraud. A few arrests were made, a few reputations destroyed, but the real players, the ones who had built empires on ruin, walked away untouched. Or so they thought. On a stormy night in late December, a private jet carrying 2 former senior partners from Caldwell and Walker crashed over the Pacific. No distress signal, no survivors. And yet, investigators found something strange in the wreckage. An envelope, sealed in wax, with a single sentence written inside. Debt paid in full. The handwriting was precise, familiar, almost deliberate. Half a world away, in a fishing village near Sitka, Alaska, a woman sat by a wood-burning stove. The firelight glowed across her face, older now, harder around the edges, but her eyes were sharp, calm. She still went by Mrs. Reed. Her cottage was lined with books, sea charts, and a single black and white photograph of 2 children standing beside a lake. Every morning, she sent out a small radio transmission at dawn. No one knew why. Most assumed she was a widow talking into the static, clinging to memory. But sometimes, late at night, a faint reply would crackle through. 2 short beeps. A signal. A confirmation. Emily had learned well. She was living in Europe under a new identity, using the last of the whistleblower's files to expose another ring of legal laundering that traced back to the same firm. She'd become her mother's quiet legacy, sharper, colder, and unflinchingly strategic. Margaret had taught her one final lesson. Revenge was not about rage. It was about precision, patience, silence. One evening, a small fishing vessel docked near the lighthouse. The captain, an older man with salt-white hair, stepped into her cottage carrying a sealed envelope. Came in from Canada, addressed to Mrs. Reed. Margaret opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph of Emily, standing on a balcony overlooking the city lights of Vienna. On the back, a single line was written in blue ink. The circle is closed. Margaret stared at it for a long time. Then she placed the photo beside her lamp, poured herself a glass of whiskey, and whispered to the empty room. Good girl. Outside, the sea roared like a living thing. The wind rattled the window panes. She stood, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped out into the cold night air. The sky was moonless, the ocean below endless and dark. For a moment, she just listened. To the storm, to the sea, to the pulse of her own heartbeat. Then she smiled faintly and whispered, You can rest now, Harold. Her husband's name. The man who had once told her that kindness, if abused long enough, turns to steel. She walked down to the edge of the cliff where the lighthouse beams swept across the water. The light caught her hair, turning it silver, and for a fleeting moment she looked almost ethereal, half ghost, half guardian. She raised her glass toward the horizon, the way one might salute an old enemy finally buried. Lightning flashed, thunder cracked, and then silence. Days later, when the fishermen found her cottage empty, the fire still burning low, they discovered her journal on the desk. The last entry was dated that night. It read, Justice isn't balance. It's the quiet that comes after the storm. And if you listen closely, it almost sounds like peace. The page was unsigned, but beneath it, faintly pressed into the paper, were 2 initials. M.C., the initials of a woman who lost everything, then took back what was hers. And somewhere across the world,
Her daughter sat in a candlelit apartment, scrolling through the news of another scandal breaking wide open. She smiled softly, whispered, "Mom," and closed her laptop. Outside, the first snow began to fall. Silent, pure, and final.
The snowstorm swallowed the world in white. Streets blurred into silence, and the city lights of Vienna glowed like dying embers beneath the fog. Emily sat by the window, wrapped in her mother's old gray shawl, the only thing she had kept from their old house in Oregon. The fabric still carried a faint scent of cedar and rain, and every time she held it close, it felt like her mother was there, not gone, just quiet. Her laptop glowed faintly on the table beside her. On the screen, another headline spread like wildfire across the news. Federal task force uncovers decades of hidden offshore accounts linked to Caldwell and Walker. The article credited an anonymous whistleblower. The same network that once buried truth under luxury now trembled in public disgrace. A dozen executives indicted, 2 fled the country, 1 took his own life. Emily didn't smile this time. There was no satisfaction left in her, only exhaustion. She closed the laptop and stared out the window. Vienna slept beneath a shroud of snow, but to her, it felt like Oregon again. The quiet mornings, the sound of coffee dripping, her mother humming while watching the rain through fogged glass. Silence remembers what justice forgets. She whispered the line to herself. It had been the last thing her mother said to her before vanishing. For years, she thought it meant guilt. Now she understood. It meant endurance. It meant survival. Her phone buzzed. A private message appeared on a secured channel, one she hadn't used since Alaska. Unknown user. The file is complete. Are you ready to release the rest? Emily stared at the blinking cursor. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she typed, "No, let them live with the ruin. That's punishment enough." She closed the app, unplugged the laptop, and placed it in a locked trunk beneath her bed, the same trunk that held her mother's letters, her father's watch, and the unspent passport with Margaret's photo under a different name. The storm outside deepened, wind howling like the ghosts of everything they'd lost. She poured herself tea, turned on the old record player, and let an ancient vinyl crackle softly through the room, her mother's favorite, Moon River. And as the music played, Emily began writing. Not a confession, not a statement, a story. She titled it, "The Price of Silence." It wasn't revenge anymore. It was remembrance. It was truth told softly for those who would never hear it shouted. Hours passed. The fire burned low. She wrote until dawn painted the sky pale gold. When she finally stopped, she looked at the last line and realized it was the same one her mother had written years ago. Justice isn't balance. It's the quiet that comes after the storm. She traced her fingers over the words and smiled through tears. Outside, the snow stopped falling. The world stood still, wrapped in peace that felt earned. Emily stood, opened the window, and let the cold air rush in. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Rest now, Mom. It's over." And far away, beyond the sea and memory, where the cliffs met the clouds, the old lighthouse still turned its beam across the waves. Steady, unbroken, eternal. Some said the keeper was long gone. Others swore that on certain nights, they could still see her silhouette standing in the light, looking toward the horizon, watching, waiting, guarding the silence she'd fought so hard to create. And in that silence, in that endless wind-torn peace, Margaret David finally lived forever. A year later, the world had moved on. The scandals were old news. The headlines replaced by newer tragedies, fresher lies. Justice had been served, at least on paper. Files sealed, names redacted, and the Caldwell legacy buried beneath bureaucratic dust. But stories don't die with the people who tell them. They change form. They hide in echoes. And one quiet morning in early spring, something stirred that silence again. A small, unmarked package arrived at the Oregon Times newsroom. No returned address. Inside, a flash drive and a single note written in elegant cursive. For those who think silence is peace, listen closer. ... MC. The journalist who opened it found hundreds of encrypted files, financial ledgers, secret correspondences, court evidence that had never seen daylight. But deeper inside the folder was something else. A video. The thumbnail showed a dimly lit room. When they pressed play, a woman's voice filled the screen. Calm, unhurried, unmistakable. Margaret David. Her face was shadowed, half hidden, but her tone carried that same quiet strength. If you're watching this, it means the world has tried to forget. That's what it does best. It buries truth under comfort and calls it peace. But peace without accountability is just another lie. I didn't vanish to escape. I vanished to finish what I started. Every signature I forged, every document I leaked. It wasn't vengeance. It was restoration. They took everything from people who had nothing, and I'd made sure they'd remember what it felt like to lose. This isn't about me. It never was. It's about every mother who gave too much. Every woman who stayed silent to keep the world from breaking. Let them hear us now, even if all they hear is the echo. The video ended. Silence followed. Then, chaos. Within days, the files went viral. The final pieces of the Caldwell conspiracy exploded across international media. Political figures resigned, banks were audited, hidden trusts collapsed. The name Margaret Collins became a symbol, whispered in boardrooms, painted on protest signs, immortalized in documentaries titled The Woman Who Vanished the Right Way. But in a small coastal village, far from all that noise, a woman in her early 30s stood at the edge of the sea. Emily. She'd seen the video too. She recognized the background, the faded wallpaper, the faint hum of the lighthouse in the distance. It wasn't an old recording. Her mother had made it recently. That meant she was alive. Her heart pounded. She followed the trail, north through the rain, across ferry lines and empty highways, until she reached the island she'd only dreamed about. The lighthouse stood silent against the fog, the beam long extinguished. The door was unlocked. Inside, the scent of cedar and salt hit her like a memory. On the table sat a fresh notebook open to the first page. Written in neat handwriting. Emily, you've done enough. The rest is mine. The world needed your light, not your shadow. Go live now. Mum. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. The tea on the stove was still warm. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She looked out the window toward the cliffs, but there was no one there, only the sea and the wind whispering through the rocks. She smiled, tears blurring her vision. You always did love your exits, she whispered.
Outside, the first rays of dawn broke over the ocean, painting the waves in gold. The storm had passed, not vanished, but transformed. Emily took the notebook, pressed it to her chest, and walked down the path toward the water. The air smelled of rain and renewal, and as she disappeared into the horizon, the lighthouse flickered, once, then twice, before its beam reignited, cutting through the morning fog like a heartbeat. Somewhere beyond the waves, a faint voice seemed to whisper through the wind. Silence isn't the end, my love. It's the beginning of everything we couldn't say. The sea answered softly. The light turned steady. And the story of Margaret David, mother, avenger, ghost, finally became legend.
The light from the island's lighthouse cut through the morning mist as if reaching out to the sea itself. Emily stood atop the cliff, the notebook in her hand fluttering in the wind. Every word her mother had written was like a key unlocking something inside her she hadn't known was locked. Below, the waves broke in regular rhythm, relentless and indifferent. Emily realized that revenge had been the hurricane. Now the aftercalm was the real test. Because you survive the storm, then you live in the quiet that follows. She walked back to the cottage. The open door creaked. Inside, nothing had changed. The wood-burning stove, the stack of books, the cedar-scented air. On the table, the tea had cooled. She picked up the notebook and sat in the wooden chair by the window. Reading the last page again, she found a second handwritten line in the margin. I did this so you could remember what it is to love, to lose, and still exist. MC. She touched the page. Her mother's writing felt like a tremor across time. She realized that the fight had never been just about exposing corruption or silencing lies. It was about creating space for dignity, for memory, for something unavoidable. Outside, a boat drifted into the pier. The captain waved, calling out something unintelligible over the wind. Emily rose, stepped outside, and watched as he tied his vessel. He carried a crate of fish and crates of silence. He asked if she needed supplies. She shook her head and thanked him. He tipped his hat and walked away, the wooden boards of the dock creaking beneath him. Emily closed the door and leaned her forehead against the cool glass. In that moment, she felt both anchored and undone. She had followed her mother's map to this island of no name, no identity. The woman who'd vanished had left her a legacy, and now Emily held it. But what did one do with the legacy made of silence and storms? She stood, walked to the bookcase, and removed a small photo in a frame, a picture of young Emily and Luke, arms around each other, sunlit, innocent. On the back, to M for everything. She placed the photo next to the notebook and sighed. She opened a drawer and withdrew the flash drive her mother had left. She plugged it into the laptop that sat silent on the table. The screen flickered to life. The files inside bore names, dates, shame, absolution. She hovered her finger over Archive Public and closed it. She walked away, unplugged the laptop, and shut the lid. This story would not become another broadcast. Some truths are not meant for spectacle. Some victories live in the unspoken. She packed a small bag, placed the notebook, the photo, and a single envelope. On the cover of the envelope, for Luke, if ever needed. She sealed it. Then she stepped outside into the dawn. The sea was calm now, a vast mirror of the sky. She walked down the path toward a small wooden rowboat at the water's edge. She untied it,
Pushed off, the waves lapped gently against the hull, the air tasted of salt and possibility. As she let the wind carry her away, she looked back one last time at the lighthouse on the cliff. The beam turned slowly, sweeping across the water, then the rocky shore, then into the endless horizon. No one knew where she was heading. She didn't know either. Maybe to a new name, maybe no name at all. But she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Quiet. And in that quiet, she carried the storm, the light, the legacy, and the choice to disappear or to become something entirely different. If the world asked, she would say she lived somewhere between the waves and the wind, where truth doesn't shout but sustains. Years later, the island stood empty. The lighthouse, once pulsing like a living heart, had gone dark again. Salt had eaten into its stone walls, and moss covered the carved initials near the door. M.C. Weathered, almost gone, but not forgotten. The villagers said a woman used to live there, quiet, kind, strange. She came and went with the tides, never aging, always watching. Some said she died long ago. Others whispered she had simply moved on, the way mist vanishes when the sun rises, leaving no trace but memory. But memory was never so easily erased. In a sleek conference hall in Geneva, the World Ethics Commission convened to discuss the Margaret Files, a digital archive of leaked documents that had been re-uploaded anonymously from dozens of IP addresses across 5 continents. It was the largest coordinated data release since WikiLeaks, and it didn't just expose one firm. It revealed a system, a network of corporate ghosts laundering their power through silence and inheritance. No group claimed responsibility. No money trail, no manifesto, just one message left embedded in the code. Silence remembers. Emily was there that day, seated quietly in the back row. She wore her hair shorter now, her expression steady but distant. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. After the session ended, a journalist approached her. "Miss Collins," he said, hesitating, "people believe your mother might still be alive. Do you believe that?" She smiled faintly, eyes glinting like the sea before a storm. "Some lives aren't meant to end," she said. "They just change shape." He frowned. "And what about the files? Do you think this will finally bring peace?" She looked past him toward the falling snow outside the glass walls. "Peace isn't what she wanted," she said softly. "She wanted memory." That night, Emily returned to her small apartment overlooking Lake Geneva. On her desk sat the old cedar box she'd carried for years, weathered, scarred, locked. She opened it carefully. Inside was her mother's journal, its pages yellowed and soft, and a small, rusted compass. When she tilted it, the needle spun wildly before pointing north, always north, toward the ocean, toward home. Attached to the last page of the journal was a folded letter she'd never seen before. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Emily. If you are reading this, then the world has finally heard what it tried to silence. You have done what I could not. You gave the truth a future. But there is one last thing to remember. Justice is not an ending, my dear. It's a cycle. Someday, someone will wrong you, and when that day comes, don't choose revenge. Choose silence. Not because it is kind, but because it is final. Mom. Tears fell quietly onto the page. Emily pressed the letter to her chest, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to weep, not from grief, but release. Outside, the city lights flickered on the water, reflections trembling like candles in a storm. She stepped onto the balcony, watching the snow drift down, her mother's compass in hand. The needle trembled, then steadied, pointing once more toward the north. In the distance, faint, impossible, she thought she saw it. A single beam of light cutting across the horizon. It couldn't be. The lighthouse had been dark for over a decade. And yet there it was. One long sweep through the mist, followed by another. Emily smiled through her tears. "You always did find a way to say goodbye," she whispered. The wind rose, cold and clean. She closed her eyes, let the compass rest against her palm, and listened. The world was quiet again, not empty, just full of everything her mother had left behind: truth, love, and the haunting beauty of silence. The beam of light faded, swallowed by the storm. But its rhythm, steady, patient, eternal, would live forever. The lake was frozen that winter, a perfect, unbroken mirror. Emily stood at the edge, bundled in her long black coat, her breath curling white into the cold morning air. The world felt paused, as if holding its breath with her. She had spent years chasing ghosts of truth, of her mother, of herself. But ghosts don't vanish when you find them. They settle inside you, reshaping the quiet. On the wooden pier nearby, an old fisherman waved. He'd seen her there every morning for weeks, just standing, watching the horizon. She waved back politely, but her eyes stayed distant, always toward the north. Later that day, Emily walked to a small post office at the edge of town. She carried a sealed envelope marked only with a symbol, a lighthouse surrounded by a single circle. She slid it into the outgoing bin and walked away. Inside the envelope were coordinates, documents, and one sentence written in her mother's handwriting: "For whoever still believes silence has a voice." That night, she returned home, lit a candle, and opened her laptop. A video file blinked on the desktop. No sender, no subject, just the title, "The Last Transmission." She pressed play. The screen showed the inside of the lighthouse, old, weathered, and still alive with faint light. The camera panned slowly upward until her mother's voice filled the speakers, low and steady. "Emily, you've done beautifully, but you must understand, the light isn't meant to guide me home. It's meant to tell the world someone is still watching. If this reaches you, let the world see that we were here, that we left more than pain behind, that we turned silence into legacy." The video faded. The sound of the sea lingered for a few seconds before the screen went black. Emily sat there for a long time, staring at the reflection of the candle in the dark screen. Then she whispered, "You're still watching, Mom." She opened her browser, uploaded the video to her channel, the same one where her mother's story had first begun, entitled it simply, "The Light Still Burns." When it went live, the comments poured in from all over the world. People who had lost, who had fought, who had endured, all writing the same thing. She's not gone. She became the storm. Emily closed her eyes, hearing the faint hum of wind against the window. Somewhere in that sound, she imagined the distant echo of waves against Oregon cliffs, the rhythm that had once carried her mother's last words: "Justice isn't balance. It's the quiet that comes after the storm. The candle burned lower. The snow outside glowed pale under the streetlights. She smiled softly, lifted her face toward the window, and whispered, "Rest easy now. The world heard you." The camera on her desk was still recording. Her voice went out into the quiet, to every corner of the night, carried by wind, memory, and light.
Intiqara Stories. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. And don't forget to share your precious thoughts in the comments, because every story hides a voice, your voice. What should be the next story about? Tell me, which character's world should we dive into next? Say it in the comments. Your choice might just become the next cinematic revenge masterpiece.